Hi, folks. Stephen here. I'm on the phone with Anne from Pikapi Podcast, and this is the next in our series of Pokemon side game music discussions. So, this time we're doing a discussion of Pokemon Stadium 2 for the N64. Just to clarify a little bit, you may remember from our Pokemon Stadium discussion earlier this year that there's a bit of a numbering irregularity between the Japanese side and everything else. In Japan, they had an extra Pokemon Stadium that had like 40 or 50 Pokemon in it. And then they had Pokemon. Their Pokemon Stadium 2 is what we call Pokemon Stadium. It's got the 151 in there. And then we've got Pokemon Stadium 2 as we know it, which they call Pokemon Stadium Gold and Silver. Yes, this is the Gen 2 Pokemon Stadium game, very late N64 game. But we're going to be talking about the music, our experiences, and we've picked out some songs just like we usually do. So first off, this game was released back in 2001, and it's kind of a bit of an odd spot because it's not long. It's very late into the N64 life cycle, and it's also at a point where and as such, the Game Boy Advance is coming out very shortly after this, and so is the GameCube later that year. So it is kind of a semi-forgotten game. People know it exists, but they don't remember a ton about it sometimes. But Anne, why don't you go ahead and talk about your experience with this game prior to this discussion? How about that?
Yeah, this is a game that I've never owned. I think I've always been aware it existed because looking at the cartridge evokes a lot of memories. Like every time I see it, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that game. I've played it a lot at fan conventions. It seems to be one that I always remember seeing in the game room, just kind of set up at a N64 somewhere. So I've played all the mini games. I've played through the battle scenarios, but I've never owned it ever. And it's kind of one of those ones that you always forget about. But I've actually got a decent amount of gameplay through the beauty that is fan conventions and the service they provide of allowing us to play free video games.
Prior to about a month ago, when I picked up a used copy, which was not cheap, that was kind of my experience as well. I don't know if I had done much with the mini games. I think had seen Pokemon Stadium 2 at conventions and at Pokemon events where they have a retro system section, which is pretty common, and stuff like that. So that was my experience at that point. I'd seen videos. I think a lot of the footage I'd seen is from the, what's it called? A False Swipe Gaming YouTube channel where they do how good was blank Pokemon actually. And whenever they cover a Pokemon that was around in Generation 2, they usually have some footage from Stadium 2 there. But all the same, so that was kind of my experience prior to all this, but I did pick up a copy. Like I said, it is not a cheap game. Pokemon games tend to keep resale value pretty well, but this one especially, I guess since Gold and Silver is a very cherished generation, and a lot of folks probably missed this game the first time. It sold decently well, I think. But I did play it some, and you may have seen that live stream I did a little while ago, and that's going to certainly inform that's certainly going to drive some of. Let me think about what I wanted to say here. And that experience is also going to factor in for me, I guess. But let's start with the basics. When was this game released, and where and how? So let's see. It was released in Japan in, let's see. Oh, sorry, my notes are not at the top of the page. There we go. So let's start with the basics on this one. How was it released and when? It was released in Japan in December of 2000. It came out in America in March of 2001 and finally made its way to Europe in October of 2001, so really late there. I think the GameCube, for reference, didn't come out in Europe until early 2002, so they were still technically in the N64 generation, but you kind of get the idea that this is obviously a very late N64 game, and they might have wanted to get it out maybe just a touch earlier if they could have. But the main series games obviously had to be out first and whatnot. As far as it was developed, it very clearly is based on the engine for the original Pokemon Stadium, or at least the one that we got here in 2000 for the first generation. And this time, I don't think HAL, it looks like, had a ton of involvement with the development of this version of it. It was mostly Nintendo EAD that handled that side of it. And beyond that, I guess not too much too special with this. And did you have any comments on sort of the development history of this game? I guess it's a little less special since it is so based on its predecessor.
I mean, it's kind of, as you say, kind of interesting for the fact that it is so much based on the one that came before it, and yet like so late well, I mean, I don't know about late in the game, but like I mean, we may talk more about this later, it being like so kind of late in the era of N64 games. It's an interesting game for where it is placed in the timeline of video games and Nintendo games in particular. It's interesting for what it is and what it is not to me. But at the same time, that is also the same thing that makes it not interesting. It's peculiar, maybe more than interesting. But I don't know that. I think we'll probably talk more about it later, so I don't know that I want to deliberate that point right now.
No, that's okay. That's okay, Anne. I mean, just to give some perspective on what other companies were doing, the PS2 had been out for almost a year by the time this came to the States, and the Dreamcast had practically been shelved as Sega was going in the process of going third party by the time this came to the States. So just to give you kind of an idea of how late in the N64 generation this was. Let's see here. But as far as folks who were involved in the sound areas of this game, it may not surprise you that all three of the people I could find were involved with the prior Pokemon Stadium game, at least the one we got here in the States. The sound director, let's see, one second here. So the sound director was Masafumi Kawamura, best known for Donkey Kong Jungle Beat and some other games that are out there. The composer was Hajime Wakai, best known for Star Fox 64, Pikmin, Breath of the Wild, and a few other games here and there, especially in the Zelda series. And let's see, sound programmer is Mitsuhiro... And the sound programmer is Mitsuhiro... Yes, okay, sorry. And the sound programmer is Mitsuhiro Hikino, who is best known for work on the Pikmin franchise. And he also worked, I always like to mention games that are relevant around the time we record this. He worked on Mario Sunshine as a sound programmer there. Of course, that's coming out in a re-release later this month on the Mario All-Stars 3D collection. So I just wanted to put that in there. And we've gone over these people during our first Stadium episode. Do you have anything to add to all of that, or?
I mean, I don't think I have anything to add that I don't think we didn't talk about before. I can't remember if I was as obsessed with Breath of the Wild when we talked about Pokemon Stadium 1 as I am now. So maybe I have that to add. Like, Breath of the Wild music is a freaking masterpiece and I love it. So I'm very happy he was involved in that. So maybe I have that to add. I don't know.
Oh, and did you finally get a Switch then?
I did not, but my roommate has a Wii U and introduced me to Breath of the Wild, and I am now on that bandwagon, and my gosh, that is some music.
Well, so. I played it for a while back when it came out. I don't remember really a ton about the music, but I didn't get all that far in the game before other things started to sort of take up my time on that system. I don't regret buying the game or anything like that. I gained an appreciation for what was going on there, but I didn't get super deep in it.
I didn't either. I just, again, a lot of music, and I learned how to cook. So that's where I am in life. So.
All right, well, let's talk about the general sound design of Pokemon Stadium 2 then. There's actually a couple of interesting things. Now, as you probably expect, there's a lot of stuff that's derived from the soundtrack of Pokemon Gold and Silver. I guess technically speaking, I think Crystal was probably out in Japan by the time it came out there, but it wouldn't come out until the summer of 2001 here, just for reference. Um, but obviously, it's going to pull a lot from that, at least as far as the battle themes go. I think they had a little more to work with than they did with the original Stadium. Um, one thing I kind of one thing I kind of observed about the soundtrack here is that it seemed to me to be a little more serious than the original Pokemon Stadium soundtrack. What I mean by that is I think the music there is more designed to sound like it was recorded in a studio rather than being played live at the event. We had talked in Pokemon Stadium about how a lot of the music sounded like it could have been played by a marching band at the event or a pipe organ at the event. And some of those instruments are still there, but the actual music to me sounds a little more like it was produced in a studio. And just before I hand it over to Anne to respond to that, I feel like there is less reverb in the music in this game than there was in the original Stadia. Maybe that's just the way I listen to it online, but it is more what we call dry. And as a result, sounds more like it was pre-recorded music rather than being performed live. And did any of the info I just spat out, does any of that resonate with you? Do you have a different opinion? How do you feel?
No, I would agree with that. Yeah, because I remember too, like the adjectives we were using was, yeah, like there was a lot of kind of that synthy pipe organ. It sounds like you're at a stadium and they're playing the seventh inning stretch and they're about to throw the first pitch or whatever, kind of a feel to it. And you feel like you're in the back row of the stadium and you're getting the reverbs and the echoes, and this feels like you're not getting it. And the thing I noticed about this soundtrack too was most of the tracks, at least in the battle area, there's a lot of clarion bells that were not present in Stadium 1. Like that was a musical, not motif, but an instrument theme that carried through most of the tracks. So I definitely think he was making a lot of very deliberate choices to differentiate it from Stadium 1, both in his choice of music mixing to make the sound more dry, more studio produced, but also in the choices of instruments he used to create a very different feel for the space you're sitting in listening to the music.
Yeah, that sounds like a. Yeah, I kind of agree with your assessment there as well. And I forget how I was going to respond to that. Give me a second to think.
Dramatic, maybe. Like I forget the word you used right off the top of your
It's
assessment.
okay. I'll probably just move on from there and we'll go from it. This happens, folks. This is the unpolished version. You get a nice little view into. But just to sort of expand on those things you said, Anne, the sort of live nature, the sort of not sloppy but more loose feeling of the music of the previous Stadium game, I think was actually criticized in some reviews. So maybe it was an intentional choice in that regard as well. From a technical perspective, I do want to mention that this game, you see it right on the title screen, it says it uses Dolby Surround, which is
Ooh.
pretty similar to Pro Logic conceptually. They're both a stereo system that tries to sort of direct sound in certain ways. They're loosely compatible with each other, and they're kind of the same thing, but not quite. It's a little hard to describe there. But basically, what that means is the sound engine maps the channels in a certain way to sort of conform to the specifications that Dolby has. And since I have a surround sound system here in my apartment, when I was playing the game, I could definitely tell the sounds were more focused directionally across the sort of thing there. So I definitely noticed that. I'm not sure exactly what that process involved and if like they sent some stuff over or got some materials from them on how to do that. But yeah, so that's something worth noting. And I guess another little factoid here: the original Stadium game does have an official soundtrack that was released in Germany, and if you dig through, you can probably find a copy for not super cheap, but not super expensive if you're lucky. As far as I know, this game does not have an official soundtrack, at least that I've seen. which is unfortunate. Hopefully someday we might get one, but we'll see what happens with that. I guess perhaps another way that this game might be considered forgotten, which is kind of a shame. But yeah, that's kind of an overview of the musical aspects. Otherwise, it's very similar. It's got the Factor 5 voiceover samples. It's got the actual instrument samples used in the game are very common to a lot of Nintendo's first-party games, particularly like Star Fox 64 and the N64 Zelda games use very similar samples in their music. So that's very much expected. That's very much what you would expect. And did you have any other general observations about the soundtrack?
Not much general, no.
All right. Well, with that being said, we've done what we usually do here, and we've each picked out 3 songs. The 3 I've picked out are Professor Oak's Lab, the Minigames menu, and let's see, sorry. I'm going to scroll down here. That's what it is. The Minigames menu and Streaming Stampede. You may kind of notice with our choices here that there is a heavy focus on mini games. We may speculate as to why that is later. But Anne, what were the 3 songs you chose?
I chose the Elite Four battle music, Egg Emergency mini game, and Delibird Delivery.
So, like I said, heavy focus on the mini games this time around. But like I said, we'll try and figure out maybe why that is, or if we just like those tunes more or what. All right, let's start off on my side. I picked as my first song Professor Oak's Lab. Now, this is based, in fact, on the Professor Oak's Lab theme from the main series games. I forget if that's really present in the Gold and Silver games, but it's definitely present in the red, blue, green, yellow Gen 1 games. So it's definitely there, but it's a rather different arrangement. It's actually got a very sort of metallic industrial vibe in it, which kind of makes sense once you get in there. There's a lot of machinery equipment. This is, I believe, where you get stuff on and off of your cartridge if you're using the transfer pack, which, like the previous games, this supports. And thus, maybe that was where the sort of inspiration came from. I kind of would like to hear a little bit of a better instrument sample version of this, just because it does have a little bit of a harsh sound, maybe even more than you expect from the instrumentation there. But those were kind of my thoughts. Anne, did you have any other ideas about this song?
I'm kind of torn because on the one hand, I would be okay with that harsh sound of the instrumentation if it matched the rest of the soundtrack. Like, it's kind of a cool remix of that familiar theme if the rest of the soundtrack was kind of going for a sort of grunge lo-fi industrial garage bandy type feel, but since it's not, it feels like a mistake. And then yes, I want a slightly more polished, slightly different quality to those sounds. But overall, like, the general idea is a cool one. Like, it is a very cool remix. It's an interesting idea. So I feel like this is an 85%. It's still an A. Or at least a B plus. It passes, but it's not 100%. It's not, it needs a little bit of polishing, but it's, good job.
Yeah, I also kind of observed that that's very different from the character of Professor Oak, who is not the most hard-nosed scientist. He's very professional, but he's definitely, I would not put him in an industrial science category or whatever you want to say there.
Yeah, I'd say Elm took over, but it's not really like him either. So
yeah, so that's pretty interesting there, and that's one of the reasons I picked that out. And let's go over to the first of your picks. This is Elite Four Battle. Now, it's obviously based on the theme from the Gold and Silver games, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why you picked this out. It's not bad or anything, but it is more or less what I would expect. Anne, do you want to go into some more details?
Yeah, the reason I picked this was Well, first of all, because I picked too many games, I thought I needed to pick something that was actually a battle song. I picked it because I thought it was a bit representative of the battle music and kind of the soundtrack as a whole. Um, it kind of had the feel of the battles and the music, the kind of aspects of the music that I liked, in that it's got like the motivation and the intensity behind it, but it doesn't feel cluttered. It doesn't feel so intense that I become anxious and I'm not having fun in this Pokemon battle anymore. And again, it has that cool bell theme in the background that I like, but it doesn't get like, there's not so many bell clangs that it starts getting annoying. So there's like just a lot of very interesting things happening musically that I really appreciate. And I just thought that that was the track that kind of best brought in all the interesting things that were happening in this soundtrack that I liked and kind of represented them all in a very unique and cool way. That if I were going to pick a track that I was going to talk about and be like, this is the soundtrack, everybody, that this was probably the best one. I mean, there are a lot of, great battle music on this track, but I think this is succinct as to why I like it.
Okay, I mean, I'll give you it sounds a little more open than what the Game Boy was able to produce there,
Yeah,
where
this
there's
track
about half a
breathes.
dozen very electronic sounds in that instrument set, and maybe this felt more. Is open the right word? Is that what you were thinking of?
I think that's what I'm trying to describe. Like, it's full. It doesn't feel empty, but I don't feel like the music is pushing me faster than I can run, if that makes sense. I don't feel that it's so intense that it's ruining my enjoyment of this game, that it's distracting me and like making me so jittery and intense that I can't focus on trying to pick my moves for the Pokemon or whatever, Like, I just feel that it's fun and engaging and exciting, and it's adding to my enjoyment, not taking away from it. And I don't know. I feel sometimes in video games, the music like hypes you up in a way that it hypes you up just a little too much over the top. And this, at the Elite Four, you're at the top of the game. You want the music to hit the perfect line of that where you're at the boss battle, but you're not over the edge. And like I said, the whole soundtrack feels like it's full and it's engaging, but it's never too much. And it's not like just computer sounds and just more. This is sampled sounds, but it's a symphony. So I may not be explaining that super well, but to me, I feel like this is something that breathes like music should.
I can kind of see that. I guess arrangement-wise, I wish it had taken just a few more risks. I don't want it to deviate too much from the source material because, but maybe more in a way like they did with the Gym Leader Castle in the previous Pokemon Stadium. There's no specific Elite Four theme in Generation 1. They just reused the Gym Leader battle theme. But I kind of wish they had maybe played with the instruments just a bit more there. It's not a bad arrangement by any means, but it's maybe not as interesting as I had hoped. Okay, let's go to my second pick, which is the Minigames menu. So this time around, let's see, I think there are 12 minigames as opposed to the 9 from the previous Pokemon Stadium. We'll talk more about the games themselves as we talk about the music, but also in our post-discussion, most likely. But as far as the menu itself, it has, I'm not sure if I'm using this genre term exactly right, but ragtime feel to it. Not sure if I'm totally using that, but it's definitely in sort of the jazz wheelhouse, as is a lot of the stuff with the minigames, to be honest. And it has kind of a street band, like you might hear in like New Orleans or something like that, in the French Quarter or whatever. And also, the other word I came up with for it was inviting. Like they're trying to get you to come into this establishment that has all these mini games or whatever in it. And do you feel those are good words? Do you have some of your own?
Inviting is, I think, a very good word. Like when I first heard this track, I I don't know that it's something that I really terribly liked, but then I remembered something you said way back during Pokemon Pinball. I think about the opening credits track where that it wasn't designed to be something that people listened to on loop for forever and ever, which has gotten me to think differently about certain tracks and what they were designed to do. And thinking about the mini games track in that light, this is a very inviting track that you're probably not meant to listen to for as long as I did. And yeah, like for something that you are really only meant to listen to for some short little bursts, it is fun and catchy for, the maybe 30 seconds at most that you're scrolling through the games. Um and then picking something and moving on. I think that's a good way to describe it. Yeah.
Yeah, you compare it to the one from Stadium 1, which I'm fairly certain that is a more carnival atmosphere, which is not completely dissimilar, but it is distinct from this one.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of part of the reason I picked it, is that they are serving a similar purpose, but this is different, and they both work, but they have a different sort of thing that's going on there. All right, well, let's see. The next one you picked out is an actual minigame theme. We actually have 3 of those between the 2 of us. You have Egg Emergency. So why don't you just briefly describe the minigame, and then we can talk about the actual musical portion of it.
Yeah, this game, you're basically a Chansey, and you're kind of trying to catch a bunch of eggs that are falling from the sky and not catch the Voltorbs, which will use self-destruct. And the music in the background is kind of this like accordion sort of music. And I picked it because it reminds me a lot of movie 5. Kind of like you're sitting on like an Italian or French cafe or just on the street or something in a Venetian background or something. It gave me those vibes and the very fond recollections of Altamar City. So that's basically why I picked it. So I liked it a lot.
Yeah, when you said cafe there, that was about what I put down. I gave it more of a French credit to that. And I was wondering, actually, if you had been playing recently Pokemon Cafe Mix that came out a month or 2 ago, since that has that particular vibe to it, which is very similar. There's maybe Tsukasa Tawada, who you will talk about in some future side games. Really like this. There's also a theme like this in Pokemon Shuffle for one of the overworld area themes as well. But that was where I thought you might be going with that. But I guess movie 5 is not a bad
another
example
2
either.
forks in a road.
As far as the game itself, it gives me a feeling very similar to the Game & Watch game. The Game & Watch was a series of games that Nintendo made back in like the early 80s before they made the Game Boy. There were these little liquid crystal display panels that had stuff. That's where Mr. Game & Watch comes from. And one of the games is called Ball. And the way Chansey moves back and forth kind of reminds me of that. A little bit, especially since it's not super heavily animated and stuff like that. The frames of animation are not huge there, but those are kind of my thoughts on it. I did like it, and I suppose once we get to other stuff that has a similar genre feel to it in future discussions, maybe we'll bring that up again. Okay, well, let's see. The third song I brought up is another minigame, of course. It is, let's see, Streaming Stampede. Now, this is basically in the format of sort of a quiz show, where the object of the game is it's going to tell you to look for certain Pokemon that are going to be part of something that streams past. They mix it up. They use stuff like Diglett and Dugtrio, or Magnemite and Magneton, or Pichu, Pikachu, and like Psyduck to sort of mix things together and some similar looking Pokemon like that to sort of mess you up. But your goal is to count whatever they're telling you to count, and if you get it exactly on, you get a certain number of points. If you're off slightly, you get less points, or fewer points, I should say. And the goal is to have the highest score after I think it's about 4 or 5 rounds that get progressively more complex.
Have you ever gotten the last one?
I think I actually did when I tried it out. I did a live stream. I don't remember if this one was particularly on there, but I think I did pretty well. In any case, what happens with that one, sorry. As far as the music there's a little bit of an intro, which I think is specific to this game, but I don't see on any like the soundtracks. But then the actual main theme has kind of this, like I said, it was laid back and jazzy feel to it. And speaking of these things that remind us of other things, now, back before I realized this was strictly a Nintendo EAD game and not a HAL game, I wanted to compare this to the Hideaway Casino in the Super Nintendo game Vegas Stakes, because it does kind of remind me there, and I can just saying that I can hear the slot machine reels from sounds from that game sort of playing in my head. But it gives me that kind of vibe, sort of a laid-back, jazzy, as I put it there. And one of the reasons I mentioned that is, like I said, the actual set design for this minigame is a game show, and usually you think of game shows as being, it depends on the nature of it, more intense and stuff like that, or maybe super silly depending on the nature of the game show and the mechanics involved. But, maybe game shows in Japan are different. I don't know. Anne, any thoughts in that area about anything I said there?
Well, having never played the game that you're referencing, I can't compare, but kind of now that you say game show, it does feel kind of like it wouldn't be out of place on like a late night, a kind of a variety bangami kind of program segment. So, there could be a place for it there. So, I don't know. It's hard to say. Like, I kind of like it. The music seems to fit. Although once I actually start playing the game, I have never once actually noticed the music, like, while I'm playing. I can only ever listen to it in isolation with the soundtrack and a blank screen. So once I try to count the Pokemon, everything else blocked out.
I can see that happening as well, and maybe that's one reason why maybe it still works or something like that. I was just kind of curious there, since you have more Japanese knowledge than I do, whether there was like a specific game show genre or way game shows in Japan are different than here in the States, because the set is very clearly designed to look like a game show of some sort.
Yeah, I definitely don't think it would be out of place. I don't know if I'm culture savvy enough to comment on whether it's definitely fits like a button, but I it definitely feels like it would fit, but
all right. Well, you picked one more mini game as your third song, and that's Delibird Delivery. They really always like to go on the delivery thing with Delibird. When we get to Pokemon Channel and some other stuff, it'll definitely be talked about that way as well, or used that way as well, I should say. But what about this song? First of all, what's the mini game about?
Yeah, Delibird Delivery, it kind of feels like you're working for UPS and taking stuff off the conveyor belt and transferring it to the other conveyor belt, or trying to load the truck or something. And yeah, like you're trying to take it to the other line and get the points before the other Delibird fill their sacks and get it to their locations. The music kind of has not full jazz, but kind of just a kind of a laid back vibe to it. But it's also got like easy listening Christmas feel, or like a winter holiday sort of feel to it. Again, with the clarion bells, which again fit the winter vibe. But the field and the color scheme looks a bit like a gridiron football field. So there's a lot of very confusing stimulus going on in this game. But there's a lot of confusing stuff going on with Delibird in general, so I kind of am here for it. But I really do like this track. It just kind of feels soft, wintry vibes, which is, my favorite holiday. And it's a little bit odd, which, again, Delibird evokes in me. And I don't know if I can say 100% that I like it, but I definitely remember it. And I keep coming back whenever I was at the convention and sat down to play it. Like, this is the first one I went to because I definitely had strong memories of it. And that, in that way, I think it's a success. I think that's how the advertisers want you to feel about it, is that you keep coming back to it and maybe hopefully buy it, right? That's how it works, right?
Well, yeah, I definitely agree with the sort of holiday theming. I think that's something that Delibird often gets pegged with for whatever reason. I mean, obviously, some of it makes sense, but as far as the game mechanically goes, you're going back and forth very hectically, trying to fill up your sack with presents, which, interestingly, at least in the US version, are things like Game Boys and Pikachu N64s and a diamond ring, which, I mean, they've got that Eevee ring now, but
I think there was a piano at one point too.
there is a piano, and some of them are worth more than others. So it's got a little bit of the scoring complexities from like Sushi Go Round from the previous game. So there's a little bit of that in there, and then to sort of. And then when you're going back and forth, the thing you have to watch out for are these swine that are running across. It's almost got a little bit of a Frogger influence on it, just a little bit there. At least the first half of the journey there, where you're trying to avoid the cars in Frogger. It's got a little bit of that in there, but yeah. So definitely interesting and not an unexpected use of Delibird from what we've seen going on there. All right, well, there's that kind of does it for the songs we're going to talk about. Obviously, there's a lot more in there, but we need to talk. The announcer is back in this one. It is still Ted Lewis, best known for voicing Tracy Sketchit, Giovanni for most of the run of the English anime, and things like that. And they really crammed a lot of lines. There's some new lines. There's some that sound a little bit different, like a psychic blast is just a little bit different in this one. Maybe it was just an alternate take they had left over. There are also some mistakes in the readings there, but there's a ton of new stuff, obviously, for the new Pokemon, for the new moves and all that stuff. I think he has more varied commentary. And what did you kind of think of the voiceover in this Stadium game as compared to the previous one?
I mean, I'm here for it. Like, I would have felt so sad if they hadn't kept him. Like, I can't say that it was any better or worse, really. I didn't notice any, like, marked stepping up of the game or de-improvement. Like, I was just very happy to have the announcer guy back.
That's kind of how I feel. I don't think it's as memorable as some of the stuff, but maybe that's probably for two reasons. One, this game is not as well remembered, but two, I think actually having more diversity, well, probably good from an experience perspective, also means the quotes are being less drilled into your head as the time goes on. One of the reasons all the quotes from Star Fox 64 are so memorable is that people play the game over and over, and you hear the same quotes most of the time, depending on what planets you visited in that one. So having more variety maybe makes it a little less memorable, even though it is technically better. But I did kind of want to mention that. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention is about Pokemon voices. I think really there's they have the sort of N64ifications of all the chirps you hear from the main series games, but as far as like actual Pokemon voices, there's some Pikachu in there. I think if you transfer your Pikachu from Yellow into the game, but I don't think the mini games have much in the way of Pokemon voices or anything like that. And was that your observation as well?
Yeah, I tried to listen. I could have missed something because there were definitely moments where I was not paying as much attention as I could have been. but yeah, like I don't recall hearing Chansey. Don't recall hearing anything in the streaming Stampede or, or the Furrets. Yeah, like for all we know, Ikoi was pre-recorded anyway. So yeah, there really wasn't much. And what a shame.
And it's possible that in the English dub that not all of those Pokemon had gotten to appear yet, because this was
Which
so
was
early. We're
a
only about
factor, yeah.
5 or 6 months, maybe into the third season of the anime in the U.S. when this came out in March. So we still had a little ways to go there. So maybe they didn't have that all in time for this game to come out, which would have required them to be done a month or two earlier. Or they just decided they needed to put more in for the announcer to say, because that all takes up space and cartridges are not huge. This is one of the reasons Nintendo would eventually switch to discs for the GameCube and the Wii and the Wii U. But I do kind of want to mention that maybe the Japanese version is different. If anyone does know, please give us a holler on that one. All right, well, I think that covers. There's obviously sound effects for the attacks and stuff like that. A lot of those are pulled from the previous one. But let's kind of talk about our thoughts on the sound and music of this game overall, qualitatively, I suppose. I definitely noticed it seemed like there was less diversity, and there's less taking of chances with the music here. You may remember we talked about that with the original Stadium. We talked about the one where they snuck in the Pokemon Center recovery chime in the middle of a song there, and there's not really that much of that splicing and risk taking in this one. And there are a few reasons for that. But Anne, did you notice the same thing?
I would agree with that. Yeah. Like I feel like they maybe disguised that in a way with like having a very different sound than Pokemon Stadium 1. So maybe you don't notice that maybe it's not so instrumentally diverse, because you definitely notice it is different. But there's a big difference between there's a big difference between being different and being diverse. That was horribly uncreative language that I just used there, but I think you know what I'm driving at there.
Well, personally, and maybe it's just the samples they use being similar to other first-party N64 games, I didn't think the music was that different. There are some definite differences, like the reverb, like we talked about. But
Yeah,
I think
that's
maybe
what I
one of the
mean.
reasons it's less diverse, one of the very likely explanation for that is that they only had one composer here, whereas the previous Steam game, in part because of that iterative nature of it, had like probably at least 3 or 4 or 5 different people who were in charge of the musical aspects, whereas this one just has a sound director, a composer / arranger, and also a sound programming person on it. So that is probably one reason why there's definitely more of a division between like the mini games, which have sort of the fun jazzy stuff, and then the actual battles, which are much more. Occasionally, they would sneak in a pipe organ or something like that, but usually they were very very strings / brass focused. Does that sound about right, Anne?
Yeah, and with like the one composer, like there's only so much you can deviate off of one path, whereas with multiple people sticking their ideas into the pot, you have many bases from which to branch off of. Mm, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that probably contributed to it. I don't think the soundtrack on this game is bad,
Oh no, no.
but
There's a
and to be
lot
honest,
that I like about it.
I think there was more music in this game than there was in the previous Stadium. So the person on here had to work extra hard on that. So I'm not saying he did a bad job. I'm just saying that maybe the opportunity wasn't there or whatever. But I definitely find the first Pokemon Stadium. I find the music there more interesting. I think it pulls from a wider range of stuff probably from red and blue and so on. Then this pulls from gold and silver. It has mostly the battle themes, So that maybe contributes to my enjoyment of the first one, which has more of the root themes and stuff like that, and like we said, more risk taking and doing fun things with those themes than this one does.
That kind of feels like a lot of criticism that um, Gold and Silver, the anime, seemed to take on towards the end of its run, where like the very beginning and the very end seem to have a lot of like interesting things and risk taking and just I don't know, interest behind them, but like there was a giant dearth in the middle where it felt old and stale and recycled and like not much was happening and not much vision and like I don't know, like people felt the original was better or like the original had more interest. I don't know. I feel like whether it's the anime, whether it's a video game, etc., like Pokemon Gold and Silver seems to have like that recurrent comment come up a lot about it, whether it's a comic. And I just find that very interesting. And I'm wondering what the common thread is. And I don't know. I find that very interesting. I want to dive deeper on that somehow.
Well,
Because
maybe that's something we'll bring up when we get to the third gen games, and especially Pokemon Coliseum, which goes in a fairly different direction
mm,
than this game or its predecessor went musically, although it is still not completely dissimilar either. All right. Well, before we get to some business keeping stuff, I've got some feedback to show and to respond to. So one second here. I got to punch up a PowerPoint like I usually do for these things. Let's see. I can get that. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, let's go to and share the screen here. This always takes a moment. Sorry, folks. Okay, should be seeing a nice black screen here. But before we
there
move
it
on,
is.
I do have a little bit of feedback on some recent videos. But before we move on, I do have some feedback that I want to share and give Anne a chance to respond to. So, first off, I have some comments that came from my recent interview with Peter Moshe. He, of course, did the engineering work for They Don't Understand, the Dream Street song from the second Pokemon movie that also has a non-Pokemon version. So that made our discussion a little bit interesting to find out how all that worked together. Richard Wright said, "Awesome interview as always," which I asked for a little bit of follow-up. And he says the whole aspect of knowing how he worked with the band and others before them was amazing. The history of his work is what he says there. And basically, a big part of our interview was explaining some of the other folks he had worked with, notably Hall and Oates, which is always a little bit fun when I get to see those little 6 degrees of separation between Pokemon music and all sorts of folks out there. But Anne, first off, I wanted to know, did you have any comments about that particular interview in and of itself?
Yeah. Yeah, kind of just like it's always interesting to see behind the scenes, but like that it is a process that is not just someone working in a vacuum, that this is like a human being like you and me who has to talk to other human beings and like uh, I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to put into words what I'm thinking, but that to make something like to make a song is predicated upon what he did with another person completely unrelated, which like has to do with something completely unrelated to somebody else, which is built upon something completely unrelated to somebody he met 2 years ago. So like the interactions, like say you're having with me, or that you met somebody at school 10 years ago, like those connections we have to people are important, which is all a very Pokemon sentiment, like that's very touching to me. So I think that was the biggest takeaway from the interview for me, is like those things matter into the future and allow us to create things.
Yeah, his whole career is really just about getting connections, because he started, working in a record store and eventually started engineering live shows. And eventually that led him into studio work and so on and so forth. There's some stuff I had to cut out that was about how he sort of adapted the technical change very well. Notably, in the interview, we talk about his live streaming, which he started about a decade ago and has proven to be very useful right about now. But it shows how one thing builds to another and how you meet new people along the way. It is kind of, especially when you're working with live bands and on the road and stuff, it is kind of a Pokemon-ish journey to that. And that's another sort of story you can sort of derive from there. But a good interview. If you haven't already heard it, it's on the podcast feed. It's also on this channel, of course. So definitely check that out. All right, so I got one more comment here. So this is our Why It Works series. This is where I use these as sort of like splitters in the podcast feed, and as opposed to commercial breaks, since we don't really have commercials usually, other than for like the Pokecasters network that I'm part of. We do these Why It Works thing. This is the Why It Kinda Works. Don't Say You Love Me. Of course, this is the M2M song that was the commercial tie-in for the first Pokemon movie. So this is from Sorencast Z, and I get the feeling, I looked at some of his stuff, it looks like his first language is probably either Spanish or Portuguese. So I'll read this off, and just bear that in mind. It doesn't have much to do with the movie for sure, but I guess the pop and dancey feel of the music encapsulates that moment and genre of music that could be and was liked by many people. So, and he says, I agree. So sort of the gist of this particular Why It Works segment is that, yes, it does not have a ton to do with the movie plot-wise or anything like that, but it is more of a bridge. I don't think he meant to say it was particularly dated as a song, but it is definitely typical of that era, even though it is relatively well-written. And any thoughts on what I've said so far about that, or?
Yeah, I think what he's going for is like, it was a song that got the moment. And, Pokemon, especially the first movie, was a film that was the moment of that year, of that pretty much of the decade. Like Pokemon came at the end of the 90s and is the 90s for us. So yeah, it's kind of why it works, basically.
But just to sort of expand on all of that, it's, what was I about to say? I can't remember exactly how I was going to follow up on that. Sorry, give me a second here to think about it. But as far as the stature of the song, at this point, not that it's a bad song or anything, but it was not at the top of my list of songs that should have been in Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution, which was another reason I guess I brought this up, was to sort of harken back to that discussion that we had earlier this year. And I don't know if you had any thoughts in that particular area.
I think if you had asked me maybe 5 years ago, I don't know if I would have wanted it. I also probably wouldn't have believed that there would have been a Mewtwo Evolutions movie. I think I've come around on it since doing this series, and also since hearing their kind of acoustic version. I think I actually, if I had a choice in the matter, I would have liked to put in that acoustic version of Don't Say You Love Me into Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolutions. I would have championed for that. or at least as some kind of alternate mix of Don't Say You Love Me. I think that would have been a nice thing to try.
That's interesting that you say that. Where would you have put it? Would it have been in the end credits like before? Would you use it as like a score element or what there?
Maybe like not the first song in the end credits, maybe like the second. Like, I mean, I think there's definitely a better song for the end credits. And I would like to see what we could come up with that could be a little more fitting. But I would like to see it somewhere at the end of the movie, or at least in the soundtrack.
Are you saying it might have worked out better than Keep Evolving or the Pokemon theme they put at the very end of the credits?
Oh, it's so hard to lose Keep Evolving. Can we just have a longer credit sequence where it plays after Keep Evolving? Oh dear, these are hard choices. We'll just put it. We'll just put it on the soundtrack then. My heart, Steven, my heart. I can't choose these things. This is why I'm not an executive.
Well, judging by the social media comments, the things people missed most were either the score, or Brother My Brother, and then We're a Miracle, and then some of the other stuff in there as far as that remake goes. I am always, like I said, one of the reasons I just belabor this is I'm always a little worried that they're going to do a remake of Pokemon 2000 and take the same musical approach. And I do not want to be the person running the Pokemon Company social media accounts if that happens that weekend.
That is not a job for the faint of heart, no.
On a good day, but that would be... All right. Well, that takes care of our feedback section. All right. Well, our next episode is... Let me just make sure I didn't have something else between now and that. Okay, 1 second here. Yes, okay. The next part is our next episode, then we leave a pause into our game discussion. All right. So, as we've said, there's not much in the way of Gen 2 side games unless you're going to count the Pokemon Mini. So this is really our last one there. There's actually a pretty decent gap between when the next one's released. I think it comes in Gen 3 in like the summer of 2003. So long ways without a Pokemon side game in terms of like the release schedule. But our next episode is going to be another special episode. I decided what I wanted to do was to cover the music of the first 2 Smash Brothers games. So soundtracks are relatively small, certainly compared to Brawl and onwards. But it's going to be the music of Super Smash Brothers for the N64 and Super Smash Brothers Melee for the GameCube. We're going to talk about the music of both of those. The way we've kind of split it up, that Ann and I are considering for picking out songs, I think what we're going to do is we're each going to pick one of the Pokemon songs. Since there's between the 2 ones, there's only like 3 or 4 different songs that are from Pokemon in there. And then one non-Pokemon song from those first 2 games, and then one ineligible Pokemon song. And what we mean by that is that, generally speaking, anything used in the Smash Brothers has to be based on video game source material. I don't know if that's a hard rule, but I can't think of an exception to that, where there's something that originated outside of an actual game that was used in there, which would certainly be a problem for certain game franchises. Like if we ever want to use Carmen Sandiego in there, that's going to be a problem. But we're going to pick out some Pokemon songs that are from probably the anime, most likely. We've disallowed the opening themes of the English and Japanese versions, and that's going to sort of be our third slot on there. But next discussion is the music of Smash Brothers and Smash Brothers Melee. But until then, Anne, thank you very much for being on.
Oh, thank you.
This has been Stephen Reich. All right, folks, thanks. Okay, and then we're going to do our game discussion.
Yes.
All right. Okay, well, as far as the game itself, let's talk about that. Now, of course, mechanically, it is very similar to the previous Stadium games, other than having, the new 100 Pokemon in it and all that stuff. and also the new types, the new moves, and of course various tweaks because they made some changes to the battle mechanics overall. But for the most part, it is very mechanically similar. I mean, maybe that was another thing that worked against it. But they did up the presentation a little bit, at least in certain ways. They're definitely going for sort of a broadcast style presentation because you've got all these little things like before the battle starts, you have this sort of news / sports fanfare that shows the matchup of the teams and the players and stuff like that. And then when Pokemon are switching out, you'll notice in the screens there they show a little bit of static in there as if it's an analog TV broadcast or something where things are cutting out briefly or something like that while things happen. I thought that was kind of interesting. Obviously, we've had the announcer as well for a while. And what did you kind of think about the overall presentation of the battles in that regard?
That's an interesting feature and something they could definitely go a lot further with, especially maybe in a future game in this, more tech savvy world that we live in. If they ever wanted to make a Pokemon Stadium in the future. But yeah, like that is definitely something that that made this game stand out in a way I wasn't expecting it to. For something that could have been very similar, other than just some new Pokemon.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of expected them to tweak the presentation a little bit there. But as far as, I don't think they'll be making another Stadium game since it is kind of redundant at this point with that. But if they could incorporate that into sort of like the player versus player mode of, whatever comes after Sword and Shield. So, if they're going to, there was that speculation earlier this year are they going to do Let's Go Johto? Are they going to do Diamond and Pearl remake, stuff like that?
Yeah.
Turns out we got neither, at least thus far. But, we'll see what they do in the future. I would kind of like to have more of that slick presentation style in the modern games for, like I said, for the player versus player mode. It was really fun having the big crowds in Sword and Shield, which they sort of have in here with some of the stadiums.
It would be cool to maybe incorporate the crowds and the kind of staticky video kind of, well, maybe not the static, but like the video element into like, say, the Wi-Fi kind of battling players from across the world kind of thing. That could be something to consider.
Yeah, and they've kind of done some of that with the live streams. Of course, a couple of weeks ago, because there was no Worlds this year, they had to do a sort of alternative online competition, which was kind of neat. I didn't get to see too much of that, unfortunately. I was busy with other things, but they are sort of working that into their lives. It'd be nice if the games themselves could contain more of those elements. Other things mechanically I want to talk about. Let's talk about the difficulty of this game. It has a reputation of being even more difficult than at least the first Stadium game released in the West. Maybe it's still not as difficult as the 50 Pokemon one that was only released in Japan. But this one can be pretty difficult when it wants to be. And there's some accusations that it sort of tweaks the percentages in its favor, and that sometimes, like in a two-player mode, sometimes player 2 has certain advantages because of how they programmed it. You'd have to really... people accuse video games of cheating all the time. In any symmetric game, that's a common accusation. So like, player versus player modes where the computer does that. So fighting games, sports games, racing games, stuff like that. And this game is also accused of tweaking some of the percentages beyond what they're supposed to be officially, among other things. But this game has a reputation of being extremely hard and much harder to beat with rental Pokemon than the prior game. And I don't know if you have any thoughts in that area, but since you seem to be more familiar with the mini games and a little bit of the battling mode, what's your thoughts?
I don't remember it being as like frustratingly hard. As I mentioned, I never owned it. So I don't remember playing it enough to really have an informed opinion about it. But like I said, I don't remember like ever becoming like so, oh my gosh, this is so hard, I quit. But I like Pokemon Stadium 1, I was more there for the mini games, let's be real. So that might be an answer in of itself. If I cared more about the mini games, that's probably where more of the enjoyment was, period.
Well, I may as well throw in a little anecdote. If you saw my live stream a week or two ago, you would have seen me hit, I guess, what is some of the difficulty of this game. Some of it is, I guess, legitimate. Some of it I'm not so sure about. Um, so when I was playing through the Little Cup, which is the level 5 competition, you go through 8 trainers, and you have these teams of very low level Pokemon. And to be honest, this is in round 1. There's a round 2 like there was in the previous team where everything is more difficult. But this is in round 1. I went through the first 7, didn't really have too much trouble. I had built up in some of the modes. If you don't lose any of your Pokemon, if none of them get knocked out, you get to continue. So on a later battle, if you lose, you can try again. And on the first 7, I never lost any of them as far as the battles go, and I managed to get enough perfects where I didn't lose any of my Pokemon to get 5 or 6 continues. And then I get to the 8th and final battle, and if you saw this, you know what happens. It was like hitting a brick wall, where it just suddenly jumped straight up. I just could not beat the guy. And I swear there's some stuff that seemed at least a little bit suspicious in this mode. And he has a gold berry on his Abra, which at that level heals pretty much the whole thing there once you get below half, which is real fun. And I didn't have too many great Pokemon to use against that. He also had Chansey, which I managed to get down at one point, like down to like 1 HP. It just barely survived because I got like a critical hit on a dynamic punch and stuff like that. So that maybe was a little suspicious. But basically, the closest I got, I think I knocked out maybe 2 of his Pokemon once in the 6 or 7 attempts I gave that. And yeah, so there's kind of my personal story of difficulty there. Like I said, you can't really tell if the game, unless it cheats in a really obvious way. Like I said, people often accuse the Pokemon games of not playing by their own rules. So this is not a new thing or exclusive to this game. But you have to actually look at like the code to determine if it's giving itself an advantage. And I don't suppose you have any reaction to that story I just told there, but it definitely happened. I have the video proof.
Definitely sounds a little suspicious. I mean, if it doesn't play by its own rules, maybe it's playing by anime rules. I don't know.
Yeah, so, that's just kind of a question there. We should probably talk about some of the other technical details. This is being a late N64 game, it's not entirely surprising, but this makes use of the N64 expansion pack. It is optional, unlike some other games, like Majora's Mask is one of the ones that requires it. Donkey Kong 64 requires it so that you could get around a bug in the game that otherwise is not needed. But basically, this is actually an extra 4 megabytes of RAM that goes in the N64 and is used for a variety of purposes depending on the game. Some games use it for increased color depth. Some places use it to try and load more detailed textures into the game. And the way it's used here is that more of the game is in a resolution called 480i as opposed to 240p, which is a whole technical thing I could get into. But basically, some of the game has more pixels to work with when you have the expansion pack installed. That causes kind of problems for streaming when it switches resolution. And the previous Pokemon game had the high resolution mode in some of its menus and when you're selecting Pokemon and stuff like that. But this one, if you have the expansion pack, uses it more. Not for the real battles, though. That is still low res. And I don't know what you thought of sort of the graphical fidelity of this game, but I figured this would be a good place to ask about it.
I mean, at the time, I thought it was really cool. Looking back, I mean, being an N64 game, it kind of like, well, whatever. I am also a filthy casual when it comes to gaming, so I am both impressed and not particularly swayed one way or the other. I'm the wrong person to ask of this question. Sorry. I know you are like extremely knowledgeable on this subject.
Well, a lot of folks say that going back to the N64, PlayStation 1, Saturn generation is a lot like going back to like the pre-NES generation of 2D games and like the Atari and stuff like that, in that it's so primitive it works, but kind of just barely, and graphically it's kind of super abstract and hard to make use of. So I've heard that comparison there. Let's see. I was about to mention something else from the game, and but you said for the original game, at least you were there mostly for the mini games. I will give the mini games in this one, even though I didn't have a chance to play too many of them, credit. I think they're a little more detailed and a little more interesting than, on average, the ones from the previous Stadium game. Because there's in Stadium 1, there's 9 games, and at least half of them are pretty basic button mashing games that don't have a lot. There's better ones like Clefairy Says and Sushi Go Round, and the ring toss requires a little bit of dexterity on there. But most of the rest of them are very much, push button along a certain thing to win, along whatever rules the game has. This one, I think, has more. In addition to there being 12 games instead of 9, which is pretty interesting improvement. The games have more to them, I would definitely say.
Yeah, I really like the Golbat one and the Mime Ball. I'm really terrible at the quiz one, the streaming Stampede, but I love it. I'm also really terrible at the Scyther one, but I'm convinced that I can get it one day.
And there's also like a trivia competition, and I guess DJ Mary shows up in the menus there, which is kind of a nice touch to bring that in from the main series games, and I definitely appreciate that being in there. So, I mean, there's definitely stuff in this game that is done better than the original Stadium. From a technical perspective, it generally is. I just think maybe it doesn't offer enough variety. Like, there's the story modes in the 2 GameCube games, Coliseum and Gale of Darkness, which we'll talk about at some point. And then even Battle Revolution has a wider variety of modes that it sort of shuffles you in between and whatnot, and gives you, I think, a little more to work with there. I guess one of the nice things here is there's a whatever it's called, the Challenge Cup, I think it is, or something like that. Challenge Cup is from the TCG game, but it has a mode where you're just randomly assigned some Pokemon, and you have to go against other folks who do that. So that's kind of a fun little, you never know what you're going to get mode as well. But I know you didn't play this, but speaking of somewhat obscure sequels from this era in the Pokemon franchise, I also played a fair bit of the Game Boy 2 that was Japan only and released in early 2001. I've played a translation of that. And I have to say that one, and I think that one costs a little bit more to use since there's no English version officially. I think I got a little bit more out of than this one, but neither one of them is a bad game. And whether they're worth it for you to play is sort of what you have to decide there. Any other sort of wrap-up thoughts on this game quality-wise?
No, just that it's kind of sad that this game almost seems to be a forgotten child, and it's certainly not the only game that gets lost in a shuffle. And like, there's a lot of factors that contribute to it, like both kind of its placement in the release date and the lexicon of video game history, but also like its timing in just time, like thinking of we didn't have cell phones and smartphones back then, and everybody didn't have a computer in their home. And when I think of like friends trying to explain to each other, like, was this Coliseum or Stadium 2? And, what is this game? They can't just be like, oh, let's just look it up. Like, it's very easy, I think, for this game to get mixed up with another one or just forgotten entirely and then never played at all. So I think it's just a little bit sad that this game maybe didn't always get the limelight it could have, and maybe never sold as many copies, and maybe didn't get as much vintage play as it could have because nobody remembered that it existed. But I mean, as much as it's kind of a shame that it's a little bit more expensive than some other games of that are of other Nintendo 64 games, I'm glad that when people do remember it, they seem to remember it fondly and esteem it at high value. That's kind of nice. So it's that going for it, at least.
Yeah, a couple interesting things about that is that, well, gold and silver, there's always that impression that in the fandom, it's this super beloved generation of the longtime fans of the thing that did so many things so right. And, maybe that's true of the main games to a certain extent, but this one maybe not, didn't do enough better to really differentiate itself, to set itself apart. And I think that is something that we're going to have to keep in mind when we get to Gale of Darkness, the second of the two GameCube battling games, to talk about that one. Yeah, so I think that... so I guess those are some interesting things to keep in mind.